It's impossible to overestimate the importance of language. It makes society and life as we know it possible. A glance, a gesture, a sound. These are the basic mechanisms of all human understanding and exchange. Without language, every day would be the first day of the world. There would be no way to build on others' experience, no way to pass on our learning. If you really think about it, there may well have been a universal original language, the language before Babel. And then, something happened. From one mother tongue, languages began to evolve. One tongue begot thousands. For some, the Tower of Babel explained it all. That mankind became jealous of God and built a vast tower. Up there, they could settle matters with a God who moved in such famously mysterious ways. God punished this act by causing every one of the builders to suddenly speak a different and unintelligible babble. It was the end of one tongue, one world. It's such a shattering moment that many cultures worldwide have their own Tower of Babel story. They all repeat the same pitiful saga of chaos brought about by a failure to communicate. Today, most people take language and words for granted, but there is a place where scientists look at language like archaeologists look at digs. The Max Planck Institute, Leipzig, Germany. Researchers here are uncovering the earliest and most common concerns of language. What do I call myself? How do I distinguish between animals and things? How do I ask questions? The research director for linguistics is Bernard Comrie.
I think there are really two questions here. One is, was there a single origin or were there several origins of human language? And the second question is, will we ever know? My suspicion with regard to the second is the answer is probably no. We will never know, definitely. But I think there are reasonable directions in which we can speculate, and we can narrow down the range of plausible speculations. So it's not just that the question is completely open. I think there are certain possibilities that we can exclude, and there's only a certain range that we need to choose from.
There are some 6,000 known languages, but over the next 50 years, most of them will be no more. It's a failing resource that can tell us who we are and where we came from. Jeff Connor Linton is the chair of the linguistics department at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He specializes in miscommunication between cultures.
I know there's a lot of concern about English as an international language, that English is going to become the one language of the world. That's very unlikely for a couple of reasons. One, that different speech communities' languages are how they express their identity. So that while communities may actually become bi- or trilingual, may add English or some other larger economic language, international language, to their repertoire. Notice that that would be to the repertoire of the more educated as opposed to the less educated, so it won't be sweeping across every culture. But they may add this as a second or third language. That doesn't mean that they automatically boot out the old language as dysfunctional. It's tremendously functional for a lot of the needs and purposes that an international language, English or Chinese or whatever, or Spanish, would not serve. So that the goal of identity is going to be served by indigenous languages.
I think that understanding language is an important part of understanding what it means to be a human being. You know, language is one of the features that is characteristic of the species we know only of human beings, and it's characteristic of all human beings. So knowing how language works tells us a lot about what it means to be a human being as opposed to any other species.
Traveling to Indonesia regularly, the linguist David Gill talks to anyone he can, recording the idiosyncrasies of ordinary speech. It's not formal, textbook language he's after, but everyday, unvarnished communication.
So there's been a huge amount of work done in the last few decades, simply bringing the facts back from other parts of the world and describing the way languages are in different parts of the world. There's been a huge amount of progress.
The ultimate goal, of course, is to find hints and allegations of the pre-Babel talk hiding in the grammar and diction of existing languages.
Where we find languages doing the same thing, then we can ask, what are the reasons why language universals are there? Why do all languages do the same thing? Of course, one possibility would be because they all derive from the same ancestor. Another possibility would be because the human brain, human mind, is constructed in such a way that only those possibilities are allowed.
The trick, when you come to study language, is not to be thrown by the sometimes eccentric ways their grammars see the world. The problem is never so much vocabulary as it is structure.
What I really learned from looking at other languages is just how many different ways and how very different ways there are of expressing things, roughly the same thought, how it can be expressed in such radically different ways as you go from one language to another. Also, maybe crucial here is the ways in which certain grammatical categories have to be expressed in a particular language, but don't need to be expressed in some other language, and what effects that has. So in English, if whenever I use a noun, I have to make the decision, is it going to be singular or plural?
Strangely, for some languages like Chinese, concerns such as singular or plural and past or present seem inconsequential.
If I sort of want to say, I saw tree in the abstract yesterday, and don't want to tell you how many trees, I can't do it. I say I saw some trees yesterday, and I've already implied that there was more than one. If I say I saw a tree yesterday, then I have to tell you that there was just one. In a language with a dual, I'd have to tell you whether it was one or two or more than two. By contrast, in a language like Chinese or Japanese, which doesn't have a grammaticalized plural of that kind, I could just say I saw tree, and it might have been one, it might have been two, it might have been more than two, it could have been any number, so that's left open. And I find that interesting. So, English, it's not just that language gives me certain possibilities, but language also restricts me in some ways. So the structure of English says, Whenever you have a noun, you have to distinguish singular and plural. Whenever you have a verb, you have to distinguish past tense and present tense. You can't get around it. You can't have something which is ambivalent or vague across those.
So among the Malagasy, for example, there's a belief that there are evil spirits out there that if you call attention to yourself, they may come and humble you. Malagasy, therefore, has developed all sorts of lexical and syntactic tricks to fool the evil spirits. Use of ambiguity, so that references to people are not by their names, but by the person who might be coming home around the time that the cows come home or something like that. And in context, people will know who we're referring to, but it's ambiguous enough so that the evil spirits will not be able to come and do something bad. Well, that's a need of that society. And so the language has elaborated that function. But another society will not have that.
It's odd to think of ambiguity as a communication strategy, but sometimes clarity is not all that important. Sometimes you want to suggest more than you actually say. Poets do it all the time. For linguist Donald Stilo, it's the flexibility of language that makes all the difference.
Language is not static and discrete. In other words, everything in this language is equal to everything in this language, so we can just superimpose one upon the other. It doesn't work that way. The world, the universe is very vast, and each culture, which is expressed through its language, divides the universe up in different ways, and we see it through a different grid. We have a grid that we see the world around us through. We can't have word for absolutely everything. That we put just millions and millions of words in the language that we wouldn't be able to grasp.
It's culture that drives language, and culture is always evolving. Nothing stays the same for long.
When we look at historical linguistics, the effort to reconstruct previous languages, the important thing to remember is that that's not just something that happened in the past and stopped. We're in a process of language change now. People are mapping vowel changes in Chicago, across neighborhoods in Chicago. The processes of change are affected by the ebb and flow of language, some languages growing in membership and other languages losing membership and dying even. So it's a constant ebb and flow of change there. You have the classic forces in language change are when people are far apart from each other, they develop differently. And when they come together into contact, their languages come into contact and influence each other. And that's still going on.
What is possible and what is impossible in the realm of human language? This is what all linguists are basically trying to find out. We're all trying to find that out by exploring two paths simultaneously, the path of diversity and the path of unity. We're trying to find out to what extent languages can differ from each other. And we get so excited when we find a language that does something that no language that we knew of before does. No, that's how we get our kicks.
For a linguist, nothing is out of bounds. Anything that can be expressed is fascinating, as is the particular way it gets expressed. For a linguist like Matthew Dreyer, the quest is not just to pin down the right word, but also the odd and tantalizing approach to the world around us.
Now there's another sort of question that underlies, I think, what you're asking, and that's the question about to what extent the particular distinctions that occur in one's own language influence one's sort of view of the conceptualization of the world. And I think on the whole, a lot of those questions are unanswered. I think they have a great effect on how philosophers view the world, but I'm not sure how much they affect everyday people. So languages that don't have a past tense, I think it would be a mistake to infer from that they don't have a conceptual distinction between something, the now, and what happened in the past.
It's what people need, not what their language says they need, that counts. For instance, it's often said that Essex have many words for snow, but their world is snow. They need a big toolkit to deal with it. Conversely, a culture without football has no need for words like offsides or yellow card.
Language is a reflection of the culture and the universe around us, and it's very vast. To show this vastness, languages deal with it in different ways, and some have words that we don't have.
You'd like to think language has a sort of built-in morality, but it's not so. Language can be an extremely efficient tool for deceit, every bit as much as for truth.
Language divides people, and it divides people in many different ways. It divides you and me and everybody else, because when we speak to each other, we create misunderstandings. I might say a word and mean one thing, you might interpret it in a different way. So in that sense, language can divide. It can also divide because sometimes we simply speak different languages and cannot communicate. So of course language divides, but it also unites.
It's quite possible that there was one point where proto-humans discovered language. I can start to put these sounds that I can make together in a systematic way, and we have the social compact to, yes, this particular set of grunts and sounds will mean watch out, there's a bear behind you, and so on. But at that point, that was actually a very Darwinian moment for the species, because they had a selective advantage. They could, just as now they could use it to organize themselves for hunting, they could use language to organize themselves for dominating other groups. So yes, there might have been a point where there was one universal language, but it was universal to a small group of people that then spread by all the traditional sorts of militaristic devices that we use. It's not that one language means harmony. Often it can mean that it's actually something that's going to help people spread their influence in not so nice ways.
If I say something, if I say the earth is flat, then, or if I say the earth is round, then the grammar of English or of any other language doesn't provide any way of distinguishing between those two. One is true, one is false, or I believe one to be true, I believe one to be false. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm trying to persuade you that I believe that the statement I have made is true. And whether it's because I want to impart genuine information to you or because I want to deceive you, then either way, the language has to use the same devices.
It's said we actually create the world around us when we describe it in words. And it's true. If we don't have words for things, we don't really see them. Until I can describe that particular tree, it doesn't really exist in any useful way. Once we have words for things, we see those things all the time. That is far from being an adornment to life. Language is life itself. Trouble is, there are so many lifestyles, so many cultures, so many ways of making this life work. And each of those ways is associated with a discrete language. By comparing languages, we can see how those tongues and societies evolved.
So if we take the Indo-European languages, then what the comparative method does is it establishes the ways in which the various Indo-European languages, so English, French, Russian, Greek, Hindi, it shows the ways in which they can be derived from a single common ancestor. It of course also shows, by default as it were, that there are some features in those languages which cannot be traced back to the common ancestor. So I think what that means is that our overall picture of language history is a picture of the interaction of differentiation, so a single ancestor language differentiating, and language contact, which is the development of similarities among languages that either were initially unrelated or only distantly related, the development of similarities because those languages are in contact, perhaps especially the influence of bilingual speakers.
Such work is very much a matter of map-making. The traces of language change are written right on the face of our planet.
Part of the idea of putting the Americas on the right-hand side with the Pacific in the middle is because, except for the movement of Europeans to the Americas in the last 500 years, there's no migrations across the Atlantic Ocean, whereas the people of the Americas all came through from eastern Siberia, so that by putting the Americas over here, you can see geographically the places where people might have migrated, and represents the fact that people migrated across. Even when you have a nice pattern on the map, you can't tell whether that's due to genetic feature, or whether it's something that's simply due to contact, whether language would borrow that feature one from another. In fact, the thing that I've been working on today is a phenomenon that one finds in an area in the middle of Africa, where in this case it has to be due to contact because it includes parts of 3 separate language families that happen to be together in the middle of Africa, and the feature's not shared by other languages in those families outside of that area. So in that case, we can tell that well-defined pattern is one that is due to contact.
If you think about our travels over the face of the globe, it makes sense that all the present languages may descend from one common ancestor, the language before Babel, constantly evolving, constantly being refreshed by contact with other foreign tongues.
The notion of a universal language, proto-language way back when, is a very romantic one in some sense, but one of the things to remember is that from that one language, you have a process of diversification and convergence of varieties of language throughout history. And each of those processes of diversification is related to language adapting to the needs of different speech communities. So that they're living in a very arid area and so on, they might develop more vocabulary and syntax that elaborates on issues that are important to them of camels and finding water and nomadic life and so on, as opposed to a farming community that would develop more their language would develop more to talk about their needs in terms of crops and seasons and cycles and things like that. So language and culture are co-adapting to each other.
To recover bits of our lost language, linguists today are prepared to retrace every one of those ancient folkways.
Well, just as you have in traditional archaeology, you map the ebb and flow of civilizations by their physical artifacts. Linguists can map the same sort of ebb and flow of civilizations by their linguistic artifacts. When a conquering army and society comes into one area, it leaves behind, if it later goes back, it leaves behind its impact of its language on the indigenous language. Or if it stays and is subsumed, then that contact situation will have other consequences for the subsequent varieties of language in that area.
Donald Stelos specializes in the ancient languages of northwestern Iran. Today, he is interviewing Iranians living in Germany. The topic is separate words that have nearly the same meaning. The question is, how do native speakers distinguish them?
There seem to be 2 verbs for to fall. One is kafene, and the other one is kalne, with an L sound. I've never heard this. And he uses them differently. And I'm trying to get from him how he uses them. So I had him give me an example of one of the verbs. Let me see if I have my notes here on it.
So you use it in different contexts, but you don't know what...
I can't figure out how he uses them differently.
But why don't you ask him directly? What is the difference between these 2?
He couldn't tell me. I did ask him. He's a speaker of the language. He doesn't know the difference. He just knows how to use it. I can ask you questions about French that you wouldn't be able to answer because you speak it. You don't know why. It's this way. That's the way it is. When you learn it as a foreign language, you're aware of differences. But when you learn it as your own native language, you don't think about your own native language. منفیش میشه گفت؟
نکفنه.
نکفنه؟ خب.
نیفته.
یا نکلنه؟
نکلنه. نه.
نمیشه.
نه.
کشتی من. There is a rule here that I'm not finding yet. Because he knows when to use it and when not to use it, so therefore there's a rule. And the rule may be very obvious and I'm not seeing it, or it may be very subtle and, it would take me a long time and lots more work to figure out what it is. It's very possible that it's an easy rule that I'm just not seeing. but there's a rule. If he says you can say it here, but you can't say it there, then there's a rule. I haven't figured out the rule yet. I need to be able to, if I'm going to write a grammar of this language, I need to be able to find the rule so I can describe it. So far, I'm not there. I see possibility here that maybe it has to do with the tense. For example, go and gone are from the same root, but went is not from the same root in English. And we use go in the present tense, we use went in the past tense. Whereas in German, they don't use the word went, they use the same root. So ich gehe, I go, ich ging, I went. It's from the same root. But in English, the go root is used in the present tense. The went root comes from somewhere else for the past tense. It could be one of these things.
Donald Stilo is working on a grammar of Vafsi, a precursor to modern Persian.
I made 3 separate trips to Iran in those days for a total of 5 years. And each time I worked with him. This is his family. He came over to our house with his wife and his children. That's me with his little daughter at their house. We became very good friends. Unfortunately, I haven't been back to Iran in 25 years. I'm an American citizen, so it hasn't been easy to travel to Iran, especially to do the type of work I want to do, research on the languages.
It's meticulous work, requiring the same sort of attention to detail as wildlife behavior. Only you're not staring at wombats, but words. It's a genius for taking pains.
In Vafsi, they have what we call pronoun dropping. Many languages of the world do this, where you drop the pronoun because it's not necessary after you've mentioned it. English, French, and German do not allow this. The languages of this area do not allow pronoun dropping, but Spanish do. So you could say, non lo so, I don't know. But you can also say, io non lo so, but it's not necessary. Whereas in French or in English, when you say, I don't know, you cannot drop the I. So when I was looking at pronoun dropping in Vafsi, I realized that Vafsi also very commonly drops the object pronoun. So instead of saying, I brought an apple home and I ate it, or I picked an apple and I ate it, in Vafsi they say, I picked an apple and I ate. And you don't need to put the pronoun in. And I had never really looked at this, and I don't know of anybody who's mentioned pronoun dropping for objects in other languages. It's very common. You can say it in Russian and, Slavic languages. It's very common to drop the object, certainly in Chinese. What I decided to do was go through the text and find all the occurrences of where you would normally expect an object to be expressed, or where the object has been expressed and then the further references to it are not expressed. So I went through and just literally wrote down each occurrence. So for example, I take a sample of maybe 13 pages, 20 pages, and I look at how many deletions we have and how many retentions we have of the object. But what I found out, which I didn't know about, and it doesn't surprise me, but I hadn't really thought about it, is that there's a hierarchy of which objects you can drop and which ones you don't drop. And I didn't realize this. And the hierarchy has to do with the animateness of the object, of the pronoun. So I have this little chart that I've worked on. Actually, it's reversed because it's going to 100%, so it really works this way. So that when you have human objects are deleted the least, animal objects are deleted in between, medium, and inanimate objects are deleted the most. See, so you have this clear progression of animate to animals to inanimate. I mean, humans to animals to inanimate. So this was really neat. I didn't expect this, and I had no idea this was coming up. And then, you know, of course, I speak Persian fluently, but I never thought about this issue. And as I check it with Persian, you know, it's clearly the same story. It's a pattern in this area of the world.
Humans, animals, things. The hierarchy of human contacts. They're all a part of our lives, familiar things we deal with using words. David Gill is working on the languages of Indonesia. Together, he and Donald Stilo are delving into the earliest intimations of language change. In fact, language is always shifting, and the mechanisms of change are probably much the same. Interaction with foreign cultures, tensions between tradition and the new, and pressures about food or money. Both these researchers are travelers in time. In space, however, is where they must go to find their informants. This is a kind of archaeology that depends on living fragments, not artifacts. It may not sound like it to hear them, but all these native speakers, in the words they use and how they use them, take part in the common history of humanity. For a linguist, everywhere is a language lab. Here it's a video store near Jakarta.
Ke London, Bet. Nonton Onda Balap ni, Bet. Onda Balap, Bet. Onda Balap. Jadi dia nonton lah, Bet. Nampak dong barat ni ah. Kata, Mustah, good. Kata, yes. Kata dia, Bet. Bawah ada laju. Pas di tengok kan, Bet. Ada good kan? Dia bilang, Mister, good. Kata, yes. Sekali telangut. Kau tu, aku bilang dah. Di depan tu, ada good tu. Kau bilang, yes kau. Jadi dia bilang kan, tu kau, ada good depan. Dan aku kata dia, yes. Kau cakap lagi kata dia. Dah, pergi dapur.
Yeah.
The laptop computer has made linguistics research much more efficient, allowing words and sounds to be recorded at once.
Tantang ikut.
Ulang lagi. Iko pincit tarui.
Iko pincit tarui itu tentang lah, pincit lai tarui.
Itu tentang lah.
Tentang.
Pakai e apa?
Tantang. Pergi. Udah pas, Bet. Coba.
All this is science, yes, but its major tool is not theory, but simply patience, passive listening, and intense scrutiny of what's being said.
Sometimes I envisage it as a report sent back to Mars by the first Mars linguistic expedition to Earth. They land here and they listen to all the people talking, and they try to figure out how these people communicate. But unlike most terrestrial linguists, they don't have the benefit, but also the burden of traditional linguistic theories. So they're not beginning with nouns and verbs and subjects and objects and saying, where's the noun in this sentence, where's the verb in this sentence, or what's the subject and what's the object? But they're coming and looking at language afresh. So what I'm trying to do is to look at Riau Indonesian as though it were the first language that I had ever encountered. And how would I best describe this language? There are people who believe that in order to learn a language you just have to buy a dictionary. and learn all the words, and you can speak the language. And of course, without the words, you cannot speak the language. But even with the words, you still cannot speak the language if you don't have the grammar. So for me, this is why the grammatical aspects of language are, in general, somewhat more interesting than the lexical examples. The lexical examples are easy to see. I mean, when you look at another language, you can immediately see that, oh, they don't have a word for this, oh, their word for that is slightly different in its meaning than our word, and so on and so forth. And it's actually more difficult to notice the grammatical differences that at least have the potential to shape our way of thinking.
It's the young who are less guarded in their responses and more accepting of the new in language and culture. Predictably, the young are also David's best informants. When he returns to Leipzig, David will spend months considering the words he found in the Far East. This is perhaps the chief weapon the young have, an ability to wind up and confound their elders with words.
Probably a universal of human experiences. Teenagers want to differentiate themselves from their parents. Well, one way to do that is to create a partially different code. And that shows, on the one hand, in-group marking, we're teenagers together. We're in the same boat, we have the same issues, and also differentiation from others who don't speak our language.
I could follow half or two-thirds. I mean, part of the point of this language is so that people don't understand you.
Speakers do this in languages that are not written, but yet they have a concept of the word. So in their mind they have a concept of the word, which proves that the concept of word exists independently of the writing system. We sometimes think that a word is something that is separated from the preceding and the following word by a space, but that's what our word processors think a word is. What our minds think a word is something much more complex, which linguists often find it extremely difficult to define. And one of the ways in which we can figure out what a word is by studying these play languages or secret languages and seeing what exactly are the units to which the rules of the language game apply.
We also find that within a particular region, there's differentiation or variation between social classes, so that the lower class speaks differently from middle classes and from upper classes and so on. Within social classes, you actually find very frequently gender variation. Now, what's interesting is that you can explain geographical variation by we don't interact as often. And even social class variation, we don't interact as often across social classes as within social classes. However, one of the interesting conundrums for linguistics is that even within the same social class, men and women use language differently. And that can't be explained by lack of interaction. And that's one of the things that linguists are still grappling with. This differentiation between genders is ubiquitous, found everywhere. It must be functional. What is its function? Why is that a very important social difference that is reflected in language? It's probably the case that men and women, even sharing very similar circumstances, sharing the same home in a sense, have very different experiences of the world. The demands that the society makes on them, the opportunities society provides them are different. A lot of the research has shown that these differences start very early, that in the early socialization of boys and girls, where a lot of society's values are inculcated, are expressed, that you get different patterns of girl and boy talk, and the differences roll from there are exacerbated by these different domains of languages, the different opportunities that males and females have in a society as they grow older.
A linguist is a geographer, not a guy with a bulldozer who moves mountains and creates tunnels and stuff like that. We're describing how people speak, not telling people how to speak.
In Burundi, one of the ways that you show proper respect to somebody with higher status is to actually speak ungrammatically. Not that a lower class Burundi speaker cannot speak grammatical Burundi, but actually consciously or subconsciously mangles the language to show essentially incompetence as a way of showing deference.
In Tagalog, if I want to say something like, I saw you, then we use two words. One word, nakita, describes the act of seeing, but then the second word, kita, is a complicated pronoun which combines both the first person speaker and the second person recipient of the activity. So kita means me acting upon you. And in Tagalog that is a single word which combines both of these concepts. So it seems to be the case that in Tagalog one word here is representing two different concepts, but at a deeper level you can ask, how do we know what a concept is? Maybe our definition of what concepts are is actually no more than a reflection of our language. How do we know that in a sentence like John hit Bill, there are three concepts? John hit Bill. Maybe it's one holistic activity. Maybe there are actually more concepts there, that such as time, which is expressed in the tense on the verb. What about place, which is usually not expressed, at least not expressed grammatically? So it's actually much more difficult to count concepts than it is to count words.
For most of our 5 million year history, we were prey. But words allowed us to move into the ranks of the hunters.
There's something unique about human beings that they have the capacity for language. And that was discovered at some point in history, and that is probably responsible for the transformation of humans from being sort of another animal that could be hunted by animals with bigger teeth to the hunter that could use language to coordinate their activities to overcome physical deficits, in a sense, and move to the top of the food chain. But there's that same sort of transformative value of language is seen subsequently in such areas as, for example, allowing for more complex social structures. It's awfully hard to manage a society, even a small village society, if you're not able to communicate. You'd be able to point and sort of, use violence to get people to do what you wanted, but language allowed for much more productive ways of managing more complex social structures.
Every rung on our ascent towards civilization has required some form of language.
Then at a certain point in history, you also have the fact that face-to-face communication, spoken communication, becomes insufficient. We develop writing. It becomes insufficient because if I need to communicate across vast differences, whisper down the lane is not going to work as well. So I need to have some way of preserving the message and transferring the message in its original form to somebody else. Well, that's writing. So once writing is developed, then you can have the kinds of more far-ranging nation states that you saw in Mesopotamia, for example, China with its development of writing very much for the management of a large bureaucratic government.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Has there ever been a great leader who wasn't good at words? Persuasion by force can never be more than temporary. Only words have the ability to bring about lasting, committed change.
One we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
This is the cold face of research, collecting evidence, noticing patterns. And every tiny victory is just another part of the vast puzzle of language origins and development. The structures are out there, in the wild, waiting for us to come pry away their secrets.
Any sentence I'm saying right now, I have never said before. We never say the same sentence. Very rarely do we say the same sentence twice at a different time. You do if you're narrating a story that you usually tell, or if you're telling something habitually that you tell. But right now, the conversation you and I are having, these sentences that I'm using are not sentences I've ever used before. Every sentence is different, such as every snowflake is different. I mean, every sentence is different. And yet, you understand me. Now, how can you understand me if every sentence is different from anything I've ever said before? Because I'm using an abstract grammar to encode my message, and you're using this same abstract grammar to decode the message that I'm sending to you. So I can, as long as I'm not using words that you don't know, you understand what I'm saying, because we've got the same lexicon and we've got the same rules that allow us to encode that message and to decode it. And that goes true for every single language and dialect in the world. People are always telling me, oh, it's just a dialect, it doesn't have grammar. There is no such thing as a dialect without grammar. If a language or a dialect or any speech form did not have a grammar an abstract grammar encoded into that speech, the speaker wouldn't know how to encode it correctly, and certainly the listener would not know how to decode it. So every little tiny dialect in the world has a grammar of its own.
In a very real way, words and language are all we have to go on. But many of them, too many, are on their way to extinction.
It was probably sometime around maybe the 17th, 18th century that the number of languages spoken in the world reached its highest point. There's no way we can test that, but that's a very plausible conclusion. So, maybe 7,000 or 8,000 languages spoken around that time. Since then, the number has been declining, and at present it's declining rapidly because smaller speech communities are being assimilated into larger speech communities. In North America, every indigenous language is endangered. So the languages which at present have most speakers are Navajo in the southwest, and some varieties of Eskimo, so in particular Yupik Eskimo in Alaska, especially on St. Lawrence Island. But even there, so even in areas like that, there is strong pressure, increasing pressure from English.
The other side of this is that even English, this juggernaut of English is splitting, even as, over the last 10, 15 years. You have Singaporean English. You have Indian English in the subcontinent. You have all these different varieties that are a mixture. It's contact between English and the indigenous language, and they shape each other. And so English will play a role, but it's going to be a complementary role. I don't think that it will be a wipe every other language off the face of the earth type situation. And it'll be competing with Chinese, and it'll be competing with Spanish, and different areas of the world will have different contact situations. And the linguistic repertoire of the world will reorganize itself, but it's been reorganizing itself for thousands and thousands of years.
It's happened before, and it's still happening. But by studying the present, we can see how these linguistic plate tectonics worked themselves out in the past. It's no tragedy when languages meld and decline and decay. It just is. Still, it's important to record these marginal languages before they're totally gone. Who knows what sorts of insights they may offer to future historians of thought and of language.
100 years from now, probably the majority of the languages that are spoken today will no longer be spoken. If we go 100 years into the future from that, it may well be that 10% or even less of the languages spoken now will still be spoken. So this task of documenting human linguistic variety is a task that is very urgent. We really have to do it over the next few decades, a certain amount going on into the future beyond that, otherwise we will never be able to do it.
And so the quest to start at the beginning continues.